Okay, hey there, hello everybody, and welcome to, I guess, our first ever outdoor lecture for Hempology 101. But, thanks. No, thanks, guys. Right on. Yeah, this is the sixth year we've taught sixth year we've taught a lecture series with Hempology 101. And normally it will be in the Student Union building in room 110. But Clubs Day is happening, so we've been brought out here for the afternoon. But I'm certainly happy to be here talking about one of my favorite subjects, the ancient history of cannabis. And so it is something that will be filmed and put up on YouTube if you want to tell your friends about it. I'm not sure if we'll get up on Stick'em Live, but normally it's live as well. But there's 22 different lectures that we have planned through the year. And in a few weeks, I hope to have a special guest, Dave Bratzer, a Victoria police officer who's running for the school board, is going to be here to talk about politics with me, and really looking forward to that. And many other guest speakers will be here this year, including Dr. Hornby to teach the chemistry lesson, and Brian will be here to teach about growing cannabis, and certainly Gail will be teaching a lecture each semester, as always. But anyway, I'm just going to jump into this week's topic, which is, I guess, use of cannabis before Christ is what I have on the list. And I'd like to take everybody back very far into history, very far past written history, to think about what it would have been like when we were first making tools. Because I believe cannabis use is something that predates our ability to control and use fire. I'm quite convinced that we started to use cannabis when we first started to eat plants, essentially when we crawled out of the ocean millions and millions and millions of years ago. Not only were our ancestors on this planet, but so were the ancestors of the cannabis plant. And certainly it wouldn't be what we would think of today, possibly as, the large, pot plants. Certainly it wouldn't have been producing the amount of THC that we've been able to get cannabis to produce now. But I'm quite certain that not only the cannabis plant would have been prolific around the planet when, say, we were one big continent back again millions and millions of years ago, when plants first started to flourish. One of the first ways to procreate that plants created was to create seeds. And so, historically, I'm quite certain that when we first crawled out of the ocean and began experimenting with different plants, that we would have found the cannabis plant to be beneficial, not just because it tastes good because of its greenery, but I believe it would have been the seeds that we would have been found to be the most beneficial when we started to consume cannabis. And now we find that cannabis seeds contain all the essential fatty acids and amino acids that you need to sustain life. You could literally live off of nothing but the cannabis seeds. I don't believe they were like that, though, millions and millions of years ago. And welcome everybody online. We're actually broadcasting this live on the internet now as well. So, welcome everyone. Sorry for being late. But anyway, our earliest ancestors would have eaten the cannabis plant as a raw bud, as it grew throughout the year, right? We wouldn't have just eaten it in the fall when it was ready with the fully mature seed. But the first thing that we would have discovered and learned to use the cannabis plant for would have been the storage of seeds. Much like squirrels can store away nuts for the winter time so that they don't starve, one of the first things that we probably, aside from just eating it on the ground, would have learned about cannabis is if we save the seeds, it's really good food for the winter time. And as ice ages began to really affect us, we would have learned more and more to save and store cannabis seeds in the summertime. In fact, I'm convinced during ice ages, we would have learned that if we kept some of the seeds over the winters properly stored, we could have thrown them in the valley or in the riverbeds in the spring, and by the fall there'd be these huge plants and we'd be able to shake them and all these seeds would come down that we again could eat over the winter and store to plant for the next season. And when you only have 3 months of a growing season, that's not much room to get a lot of protein. And I'm quite convinced that one of the reasons why the cannabis seeds are so good for us is because we literally live for thousands and thousands and millions of years traditionally, eating the cannabis seeds for our own health. Now, the next use of cannabis from seed would likely have been the stalk. Cannabis stalk is not only one of the highest producers of biomass in the planet. There's only a few plants that can produce fiber quicker than cannabis. But they're very, very strong. It's one of the strongest natural fibers that we can grow. And certainly back when we were developing shelters, we would have been trying to make nice mats for our floors. And one of the other properties of cannabis and THC, it seems to be not only an antifungal, but it's an antibiotic, and it also, when in the field and otherwise, seems to kill pests or at least deter pests and insects and stuff from growing. That's why when you grow it in the field, you don't need pesticides and herbicides, because it outgrows the other plants. So you don't have to worry about other weeds in your pot field, because the cannabis is going to grow so tall and thick that no sunlight will get to the weeds. But it's also really good for killing bugs. And so we would have used cannabis to create mats. We would have just taken the stalks and at first probably just threw them on the floor, but eventually we would have learned to weave using cannabis stalk. And at first it would likely have been pretty close to whole stalk, but we would have learned that you just got to bat the stalk around a little bit and take out the hurd, which is the cork in the middle of it, and you'd actually end up with something that would be really nice and soft. And the first weaving, I'm quite sure, was weaving mats and rugs for the bottoms of our caves or other dwellings that we had. And it would have kept the bugs away, it would have kept it from going moldy, it would have been nice and soft on our feet, and again, it would have helped develop the early fabrics that eventually became canvas. Because, the flag's over there right now, but canvas, the root word for that is cannabis. And that's essentially, the stalk just woven together with the herds taken out. And so traditionally, I believe that we would have used it for our mats and rugs as well. Now, there's no doubt, 900,000, 800,000, a million years ago, when we started to control fire, when we could start making fire, and whether it was for cooking or for heating our dwellings, we would have begun experimenting with different plants and things to see what burned and how well it burned, how long it burned, how much heat you got from it, and otherwise. It certainly, wouldn't have been long before we experimented with the cannabis plant and threw some of it on the fire and saw what happened. Well, most of us should be familiar with hotboxing by now. You're in university, so it's something that I'm quite convinced our earliest sort of cave dwelling or whatever shelters people had, they would have experimented with the cannabis plant, and that would have been the beginning of what historically became the burning of incense in the temple. Because if you look back in ancient history, say that the Bible, it's hard not to talk about the Bible with ancient history, the incense that's referred to throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, but not as much, but the Old Testament certainly contains a lot of references to incense, and most of that incense was hashish. The spice trades that were developed in ancient history had a lot to do with getting the hash to Egypt, which was the main consumer of hashish until a few thousand years ago. But as Egypt grew into such a large community, their use of hash and the use of it for religious purposes just got kind of out of control, and it was something that was also used throughout the Middle East as well. But the incense again that was referred to would have been more what you would think of now as what we call Napoli's temple balls. I should have brought one of the pictures I got, but Napoli's temple balls are sort of like balls of hash that have been collected, and if you kind of light one end of it, it'll just slowly keep burning, much like incense does today. And so they used to have these great big stone altars that they would put the hashish on, and it would just slowly burn, and then they just throw more balls of Napoli's temple hash on top of it, and it would fill up the temple. And so when Moses was speaking to God through the smoke in the temple, that was actually hashish that God was smoking to him through. The burning bush on the mountain that Moses spoke to that wasn't being consumed was actually Moses rubbing the resin off of the plant. So the plant wasn't being consumed, but the hash was, because he was collecting the hash off the plant high up in the mountains and then communing with God. In fact, in one of these communions with God through the smoke, Moses was told how to make anointing oil. And if you look up the Old Testament, in Exodus, the recipe for Moses' anointing oil contains 7 pounds of cannabis and a few other herbs as well. I think there's 6 or 7 ingredients in it, but the main ingredient, aside from olive oil, was cannabis oil. And so it's something that one of the benefits of cannabis, well, all the benefits, the anti-inflammatory and even somewhat the mind intoxicating effects, but certainly the muscle relaxing effects and others occur when you apply it through the skin as well. And the ancient peoples, it's hard to say exactly how all these ceremonies develop, but for example, the Hebrews, when they would initiate a priest, there was this anointing ceremony that would occur at high noon. And what it would entail would be the initiate into the priesthood would be spending the morning, breathing in the hash from this temple while people were singing and chanting. And they would be wearing a white robe, and they would have a long beard and long hair. And they would take this vat of oil, this olive oil with 7 pounds of cannabis cooked into it, and they would slowly pour this oil over the initiate's head. So as much of it absorbed into his hair and his clothes and his skin as possible. And so after this oil was poured over them, they would then at high noon be taken out to the top of the stairs. And back then in the older cities, they would have a big courtyard, and on the south-facing side, they would have the temple, and they would have a big set of stairs, and the temple would be at the top of it. And so they would bring the initiate out to the top of the stairs, and he would be literally glowing with light in part from the cannabis plant. And that would be their initiation into the priesthood, and they would be seen at that point as the son of God. And the sun god Apollo and many other peoples or initiates into other religions would use very similar ceremonies. The Hebrews did not invent this by any means. But the idea would be at high noon that they would come out, and not only would the people see them as this light and this glowing figure, but the initiate themselves would be glowing and feeling in a way that they've never felt before. And when people were initiated into ancient religions, into the priesthood in particular, they weren't just convinced that their god or goddess had power because of the words that were spoken. Quite often a plant would be used to convince the initiate that the god or goddess that they were going to worship or give credit to had great power and had great influence and could communicate with you. Which is one reason I'm convinced that magic mushrooms were probably just as important for our development intellectually and spiritually as the use of cannabis, because magic mushrooms open you up to new possibilities and ideas as well. But certainly the cannabis plant would also give the initiate a feeling of well-being and peace and communion with life and others around them in a way that they would never have been able to experience before. There's nothing like a couple drugs to make you love other people and the world around you. And so the experience that these initiates would have felt, whether it was magic mushrooms, which I believe was used in a later stage of the initiation into the priesthood, but or cannabis in its more milder form, but certainly it is something that in almost every religion around the world, the priesthood or the priests shouldn't use that word for all religions, that's for sure. The shamans, I should say, would often use plants and plant magic to convince again the people that their god or goddess had great power and influence and knowledge. and that still continues around the world today. And so, the Egyptians, in fact, also used to anoint themselves with oil quite a bit. I forgot to bring it here, unfortunately, but I got this really neat picture of a couple of Egyptians with this. It just looks like a pile of dirt on their head, really. But the Egyptians used to take some hash and sort of like the incense that I mentioned before with some frankincense and stuff, and they would actually put a pile of it on top of their head and a ring of gold as well, like a bracelet almost around their forehead, and that would help hold the oil on their head so it would absorb more into their skin and brain through their top of their head there. This used to be something that they would do at all sorts of different kinds of ceremonies and gatherings, weddings and stuff. One of the other ways that you can see Egyptian hieroglyphics portraying the use of cannabis is on these long sticks that will have a burning incense piece underneath it, because they also used to have apparently like these long incense burners that they'd have some hash burning, and they would stick it under the nose of the various leaders, and they would sit there and inhale more directly. Like I say, Egypt for thousands of years was the main place that cannabis was consumed, but it certainly wasn't the only one. The oldest known use of hemp is from some of the earliest pottery in the world. All the way in Taiwan, they have found pottery where they had the hemp fiber in the outside of it for decoration and to try to hold the pottery together. When they were still developing kilns, they didn't have the means to make really hard pottery, but having some hemp fiber mixed in made the pottery stronger. They found, I think the oldest person found with cannabis seeds was found in Russia. Someone died in the mountains thousands of years ago, and they had, I think there's 16 different seeds and nuts that were found that they were packing around as food, it seemed like. There also have been many burial sites found in China, ancient sites where burnt offerings seem to have been left behind with cannabis seeds in them as well. And so the ancient history of cannabis is fun to speculate about. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, but it's hard to know for certain, really where and when cannabis started. But there's definitely time periods where we were separated from it, it seems. And while we spread across the planet and developed different genetics, so did the cannabis plant, which is why it's so diverse today. And so the plants that you see high in the Himalayan mountains are quite different than the ones that were growing here in North America. And there were cannabis plants growing in North America when the settlers first came here. They identified the hemp plants growing on the banks of the St. Lawrence River when they were coming here. And it was used in some small pockets, but it was wiped out very long ago when many other native traditions were in southern North America. But it wasn't, in eastern North America. But the cannabis plant didn't appear in South America at all. So it seems like, it's the ancestors of the cannabis plant did, grow up on this, ancient one land. When we split up, it stayed somewhere probably in the mountains of Asia. And so it's quite likely that in China, the cannabis hemp plant essentially has been growing for tens of thousands of years. But the reason that it spread was quite likely what we've come to know often as the Aryan race. But there were very nomadic peoples from southern Siberia area that would have spread the plant from China to the Middle East and then eventually to Egypt. I guess I would like to also just mention too that the anointing oil that Jesus apparently used did contain cannabis. That was the anointing oil that was used by the priesthood. And I'm sort of touching towards the history of Prohibition, but the priests, when Jesus was alive, were allowed to use the anointing oil, but they weren't allowed to share that with the general public. And so he was actually breaking religious taboos by sharing the anointing oil with sick people, because the religious prohibitions of the time did not allow for people to use that. And I guess I should mention too, though, I didn't talk about the tree of life somehow. Because the cannabis plant was used for food, for fiber, and for incense, and for communion with God for so many thousands of years, I believe that we, historically, in various large civilizations, identified the cannabis plant as the tree of life. And this goes back to the earliest pictures that were ever made of the cannabis plant, and gradually, more stylized versions of it were made, so that the modern day Kabbalah imagery, I believe, is a representation of the cannabis plant, but it's been so far removed from its original use that the Jewish people and others that prescribe to the Kabbalah wouldn't identify that. But I have absolutely no doubt of that, studying many ancient civilizations, the Assyrians in particular. The Assyrians were a very large, very powerful civilization, but they didn't last for very long. They lived in modern-day Iran and Iraq, and they worshipped the tree of life. And if you look back in any of your books in school and stuff about the Assyrians, you see that they had these gardens with this amazing stylized tree of life, which looks like a cannabis plant. They have all these pictures of the god or different deities collecting resin from the cannabis plant as well, with sort of sponges and buckets. Of course, no one in the academic community really knows exactly what these buckets are for and what these people are doing, but I have absolutely no doubt of that. In fact, the BC Museum has an Assyrian altar, like I mentioned before, one of the hash burning altars, and they don't know what it's for. It's the most expensive item in the BC Museum, and they will not acknowledge that it was for burning hash, because it's cupped in a way that they would never have done blood sacrifices, because they would have the blood draining so it didn't pool up. But this altar, about this big, it's worth about $3 million, is a hash burning altar, and I don't even think they put it out to the public because they don't even know what it is for yet. But certainly the Assyrians not only worshipped the tree of life and the cannabis plant as such, but one of the reasons why the early Christians wanted to stop their people from worshiping the tree of life and using the cannabis plant was because it was seen as part of the Assyrian culture that they hated so much, because they had kept them in slavery. They're actually, the Babylonian culture and the Sumerians as well, who the Babylonians held the early Christians in captivity anyway. And so because the Babylonians and Assyrians worshipped the tree of life, the early Christians and Jewish people had a real sort of hate on for it. And so I guess I should give my friend Chris Bennett some mention here. My friend Chris Bennett wrote a few books on cannabis. This one here, Cannabis, the Soma Solution, is his most recent. Chris and I battle over a few issues, but really he's the most knowledgeable academic in the world. And Chris and I believe firmly that the tree of life is a representation of the cannabis plant. There's really no doubt about that. We do disagree with the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because Chris believes that represents the cannabis plant as well. I firmly believe it represents the magic mushroom and the ability of mushrooms to awaken people's minds and open them up to new possibilities. And I believe it was the religious use of magic mushrooms that the church was so opposed to, much more than the use of cannabis, and in fact blamed women for gaining understanding through the use of mushrooms, and condemned both women and the use of mushrooms in so doing, and were able to gain and maintain a lot of control over people and their religious practices and what they thought and believed by both removing magic mushrooms from people's plates, as you could say, and not giving women the ability to lead in any ceremonies. And so the prohibitions, as written about in the Old Testament, have much more to do with population control than they do with anything else, as far as I'm concerned. And again, I'm firmly convinced that it's our knowledge that was gained by the magic mushroom that was the main target of these early priests. But cannabis and the tree of life were brought into that. In fact, any plant that healed or brought enlightenment was not allowed by the Christian church from that point forward, once the book of Genesis and the earliest prohibition was made church doctrine. From that point forward, God healed. Plants didn't heal anymore. And anyone that used a plant or a ceremony that wasn't Christian was killed. And it's quite ironic that they would then basically copy these very same sacraments with the ceremonies of Jesus Christ at the Last Supper. This is my blood. This is my body. Those are statements that the priests in ancient times would have used when they were sharing magic mushrooms and the cannabis plant, because these ancient gods and goddesses were actually seen as being the plants and the mushrooms. There was no separation between the divinity and the physical existence of these mushrooms and the cannabis plant. And so when you consumed these plants, you were in fact taking part of the body or of a god or goddess inside of you, and that was a ceremony that in fact Jesus was reenacting. And again, it's quite ironic that these pagan ceremonies, and all this magic that we used to do was suddenly condemned, and Christian magic and Christian sacraments were okay. But again, that had more to do with controlling people's ability to think for themselves, to learn on their own without being told what to do and what to think. And it's something that I believe obviously is a great wrong that has occurred. But my half hour has gone up real quick, so I'm going to wrap up the lecture here, folks. We might be back here on the lawn again next week. We might just go indoors when the weather stops us. I really like being out here. It's a great venue. So we'll be back here next Wednesday. I'm going to talk about the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. And you'll learn, the earliest sort of forms of prohibition, the latest. Next semester is when I do the history of prohibition, and that's when I really try to save my Christian bashing, but I couldn't help it a little bit here. But certainly next week I'll talk about the economic reasons why cannabis has been taken out of our world for the most part now. But I'd really like to thank everybody again for coming. This is the 6th year of the free non-credit Hempology 101 lectures. We film it and put it up on YouTube if you want to watch any of the past lectures. And otherwise, I'm really excited to be back here this year. And yeah, thanks again everybody for coming out. We'll see you all at 420. Have a great day, and smoke them if you got them. Woo! Thanks for coming, everybody.